Welcome to Unit 6, Lesson 2. Today we're going to be talking about Part 2 of the digestive system. So we left off at the esophagus. Now we're going to move on to the stomach and beyond. So by the end of today you should be able to achieve all these goals. So to begin with, let's take a closer look at the stomach. The stomach, in particular, I can't see all of it because it's hidden in here behind the liver. It comes down like this. And some people, with a little bit of imagination, like to say that it's a J shape. And at its entrance and exit, has little sphincters that control what enters it or leaves it. So we're looking here at the stomach. And if we're going to look at its structure in detail, there's a few key points. First, we need to remember it is part of the digestive tract. Which means it has the 4 key layers. If we remember from last day, those 4 key layers, the one closest to the lumen of the stomach, or where the food contents of the stomach are, is the mucosa. In your stomach, this is well developed. Below that, or outside of that, you have that's right, if you said submucosa. And then outside of that, starts with an M. That's correct, muscularis. And again, in the stomach, this is particularly well developed to help you churn your food. And then on the outer layer, to help things keep from chafing, you have your serosa. Okay, so it has those 4 key layers. It's often, as I mentioned above, considered to be J-shaped. And it'll typically expands to 1 liter with a max of 4 liters. So some people like to play this game, make a bet that someone can't drink 4 liters of milk without being sick. Most people can't, because they'll max out the capacity of their stomach. But it's not just milk. If they tried to drink 4 liters of anything, they'd be challenged. And the reason it can expand is because it has special folds of skin called rugae. And these rugae give it extra space so it can stretch out. Okay? And just to go back up to the top, 2 key features I mentioned were the sphincters, and last day we mentioned the sphincter that controls things entering from the esophagus, and because it's close to the heart, it's called the cardiac sphincter. And not only does this control things entering the stomach, it prevents stomach acid from leaking up into the esophagus and causing heartburn. And should you have the misfortune of vomiting, this is the one that has to open to let the food back out. And at the bottom, the sphincter between the stomach and the small intestine is called the pyloric sphincter. I don't really have a trick for remembering the pyloric sphincter. It's just the name. And that's the one that separates stomach from small intestine. Okay? And one more important term we need to know is, and sometimes we talk about blank acids, or you might have a blank upset. It's a fancy word for referring to the stomach, and it starts with a G. Can we get the rest? A, S. You guessed it yet? Gastric. Okay. Is a fancy term referring to the stomach. So you might have gastric ulcers, you might have a gastric upset, you might have gastric juices. It all is referring to the stomach. So that's the overview of the stomach, but we're going to take a really close look in particular at the mucosa, because the mucosa produces many substances that are key to how the stomach functions. Okay. So if we're going to look at the function, we have to take a closer look at its structure. So we go down here and we start talking about the function of the stomach, and then we'll refer back up to the picture as appropriate. Okay. So the first function of the stomach is mechanical digestion. And this is simply the churning of food. And what was that food called when it was all chewed up and swallowed through our esophagus, that mix of food and saliva? We called it the bolus. With our fancy name for stomach juices. That's right, gastric juices. To produce an acidic sort of soup called chyme. And this, again, if you have the misfortune of vomiting, this is what's coming up, chyme. Okay. Now the second function of the stomach is chemical digestion. Chemical digestion occurs via gastric juices. Which are produced by blank and include several key ingredients. Okay, so produced by what? By which layer? If you said the mucosa, you are correct. And if we go up to this picture here, just give you a minute to catch up on your writing. if you go up to the picture here, what we're really looking at is that lining of the stomach. Okay, so all of this is the lining of the stomach, the 4 layers. And in particular, they're zooming in closer and closer to look at the details. So each arrow represents a magnification or a zooming in. Okay, and we're going to focus on what happens in these pits. They're called gastric pits because they're the pits of the stomach, and it's where the different ingredients of your gastric juices are being produced. So we're going to look over onto the next page and write gastric juices include first, we have HCl, or hydrochloric acid. If you're not comfortable with HCl representing hydrochloric acid, write that whole thing down. So, write it right here. Hydrochloric acid. Okay, but from now on, we're just going to refer to it as HCl. And these are produced, or is produced, by cells called the parietal cells that line the gastric pits. The way I remember parietal cells with HCl is you get your P for your parietal and your H for HCl, giving you your acid. Okay, so the P here goes with the H up here, pH. Okay, so your parietal cells produce your HCl. If you go all the way up here, we can see here's your parietal cell producing your HCl, and they line the gastric pits. Okay. So they produce hydrochloric acid, and you get a pH of approximately 2. And the purpose of this is to, first of all, kills bacteria. It also breaks apart I won't choose that word because it could be confusing. It breaks apart, the acid breaks apart three-dimensional structure of proteins. And if you think all the way back to Unit 2, we talked about how acids can influence three-dimensional structure of protein. And it basically opens up the protein, making it more accessible for digestion. Has one more important role. It converts a very important enzyme called pepsinogen which is inactive to pepsin, which is active. again, because it influences, pH influences three-dimensional structure of proteins. And in this case, instead of being denatured by that acid, it's actually activated by that acid. Okay. The next ingredient of gastric juices is mucus. And this is produced by goblet cells. And I find this easy to remember because gob just makes me think of mucus. That just may be something strange about my personality, but I can connect the two together. So here, if we look for the goblet cells, they're actually labeled mucus neck cells. And other diagrams, you'll get them being called the goblet cell. Okay, so equals mucus. So we go down here. Why do we need mucus? Well, it's essential because it protects our stomach. So it protects the stomach from being digested by its acid. And it used to be thought that people who were under stress would actually get stomach ulcers because they'd produce excess acid and it would eat away at their stomach lining. But we now have found out that ulcers are actually caused by a bacteria called H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori, but for short we call it H. pylori, that interferes with mucus production. Leaving the lining vulnerable to acid. So it starts to eat away at the acid, and that's painful. And finally, the third main ingredient of gastric juice is the inactive enzyme pepsinogen. Which will become active pepsin. And pepsinogen is produced by chief cells. Sorry, I went back and added cell after goblet. And the way I remember pepsinogen is produced by chief cells. The chief is number 1, Pepsi is number 1. I don't believe that. I actually like Coke, but that's personal preference. But I still remember Pepsi vows to be number 1, and chief is the number 1 in charge. So chief cells produce inactive pepsinogen, which is then activated when it mixes with HCl. And it's important that it doesn't become active in the cell itself, because its job is to actually digest protein. And if it was active in the cell itself, it would start digesting the cell. Once it's in with the gastric juices, it's protected, the stomach lining is protected in part by the mucus. So it's only going to focus on digesting the contents of the stomach. And the way pepsinogen works, we talked about it in chemical digestion. Protein plus water. What type of reaction is that going to be if we're going to use water to break it down? We said hydrolysis. Excellent. It's going to take it down not all the way to the single building blocks, but to smaller chunks of the protein called peptides. Okay. And we'll just put the name of the enzyme over the arrow to indicate that it helps speed it up. And I'll put in brackets OGen so we remember that's the inactive form. Okay, so if we just go all the way back up to the top of that picture, we can see up here the chief cell equals pepsin, OGen. Okay, so that's the main sort of chemical digestion involved in the stomach. And the last thing we need to mention, and I'll just put it right here in the margin, you guys will probably have room on your page, is 3. The stomach actually does a very small amount of absorption. Hardly anything gets absorbed in the stomach because it can't make its way past the mucus to actually be absorbed. But one thing that does get absorbed through our stomach, and the reason why it can affect us, especially if we haven't had any food to sort of block its absorption, is alcohol. So it can get into our bloodstream much faster than, say, the nutrients from our food. This is actually really dangerous because people who are chronic alcoholics can actually suffer malnutrition because they get the energy from the alcohol. They don't necessarily feel hungry and they don't eat the things that are actually healthier for them. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at the small intestine. And in our picture, our small intestine starts here with the pyloric sphincter. And progresses down behind the large intestine in this picture, back and forth, until eventually it joins the large intestine. And it has 3 main parts to its structure. We'll start discussing the structure right here beside it. Now it's very long, so it's not called the small intestine in reference to its length, but rather in reference to its diameter. So compared to the large intestine, it has a smaller diameter than large intestine. Okay. And that diameter is approximately 2.5 centimeters. Its length is actually fairly impressive. On average, it's approximately 6 meters. And chyme, which we discussed above, enters the small intestine, which we'll abbreviate SI, in squirts. As the pyloric sphincter repeatedly opens and closes. So your contents from your stomach don't all immediately pass into your small intestine. They pass through in little bits and pieces so that they can be mixed up with the contents of the small intestine and actually absorbed. Now, the important part is the small intestine can be divided into 3 sections, namely the duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum. And each section specializes in a different function. So you're going to look at the functions of the small intestine. We'll look at them by section. So first section is the duodenum. And this is the first approximately 25 centimeters of the small intestine. And it has ducts, not quack quack, but ducts as in duct tape. And ducts are just tubes. Which receive secretions from accessory organs. So we're going to go down here and just list the accessory organs or the secretions it receives. So A, it gets secretions from the gallbladder and liver. In the form of bile. So the gallbladder and liver secrete bile into the small intestine. The function of bile, if you recall, is to emulsify fat to effectively increase their what? You said surface area? Correct. So that they can be better digested or more efficiently digested. As well, the duodenum receives secretions from the pancreas. In the form of pancreatic juices. Which contain many substances that are key to the functions in the small intestine. And these include, I'm just going to start We're still listening about the pancreas, but I'm going to write it over here just because there's quite a bit to say. So it includes sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate is a very important component in our body. It's not only in our digestive system, it's also in our blood, and it acts as a buffer. In this situation, sodium bicarbonate, which is shortened NaHCO3, acts as a base. Now, what would we want a base for, considering there's this chyme entering the small intestine? What would the base do to the chyme? To blank the acidity of chyme. If you said it would help neutralize, you're absolutely correct. And it's important that we neutralize that acidity because we want to do absorption in the small intestine, which means we can't afford to have all that mucus in the way, and it's vulnerable to the acid if we don't neutralize it. Okay. As well, it contains an enzyme called pancreatic amylase. And we visited that the first day when we were talking about chemical digestion. Do you remember what pancreatic amylase did? Okay. We had starch plus H2O, and with the assistance of pancreatic amylase, which is an enzyme, we produced what disaccharide? If you came up with maltose, you'd be correct. As well, pancreatic juices contain trypsinogen, which becomes active trypsin in basic pH of the small intestine. So not only does sodium bicarbonate neutralize the acid, it takes it just slightly to the basic side. And trypsin takes proteins plus H2O, breaks them down a bit, but not all the way, to peptides, which is a process that we began in the stomach with what enzyme? You said pepsin. You are correct. And we had to continue it here with a different enzyme because we changed the pH and essentially denatured the enzyme from the stomach. Okay? There's a trick for remembering trypsin and pepsinogen, which one's from the stomach and which one's from the pancreas, small intestine. Okay? I remember TP, toilet paper, TP, trypsin is from the pancreas, and PS, pepsin, is from the stomach. And then you just have to remember, anything from the pancreas works in the small intestine. So now we've taken care of our starches, we've taken care of our proteins. We also start digesting our fats using lipases So fats plus H2O goes to, what's the backbone of fat? You say glycerol. Plus, because it's a triglyceride, 3 fatty acids, you'd be correct. Now we only have one class of biological molecules left to work with, and that is the pancreatic juices also contain nucleases. Starts digesting the nucleases, including or which digest nucleic acids plus H2O to nucleotides So those are the contents of the pancreatic juices that enter the duodenum. As well, duodenum releases directly into itself a few more enzymes, in particular peptidases, to convert peptides to amino acids, and nucleosidases to convert nucleotides to phosphate plus sugar plus bases. Okay. Now I'm going to go on to the next page, which you don't have in your booklet. It's just because I tend to write much bigger on the screen. You should have enough room, but if not, you could get a blank page and just insert into your booklet here. So that's what the duodenum does. It basically secretes things. So let's summarize. Duodenum sorry, spelled it wrong. Duodenum functions to collect pancreatic secretions and also secretes enzymes to digest all 4 groups of biological molecules. And you should go back from Unit 2 and make sure that you can recognize the structures of these biological molecules, which include carbohydrates. It's the next major group. It starts with P. You said proteins, excellent. The next one, the fancy name for fats, I said lipids, good. And the one that stores our genetic information, I said nucleic acids, fantastic. So that's the duodenum. That's the difficult one. Then we get the jejunum, and its main function is to absorb amino acids, simple sugars, and nucleotides. And indeed, the further breakdown of nucleotides, phosphates, we already said sugars, and bases. So it can absorb both. To do this requires blank surface area and blank transport. What do you think? If you said high surface area, you'd be correct. And because we want to get as much nutrition into the cells as possible, if you said active transport, you'd also be correct, meaning these cells lining the jejunum would have to have lots of what? What type of organelle to provide the energy? If you said mitochondria, you'd be correct. Okay. And finally, 3, the ileum's main job is to absorb fats. And I'm going to say fats. I'm not going to go into the details of the glycerol and the 3 fatty acids because it's actually quite a complex process, but sufficient to say it's going to absorb fats or the building blocks thereof. It's not precisely absorbing the fat. It actually makes alterations to the fat so that it's easier to absorb. It's not a process we need to know about in grade 12. Okay, so if we take a closer look at the small intestine, and if your notes went down into this section a bit, that would have been okay. We're just going to zoom in on the small intestine, and what we're going to look at is these little projections here. So the lining of the small intestine has millions of microscopic finger-like projections. Called villi, or villus singular. That give the SI a velvet-like texture. And dramatically blank its SA to maximize blank. If you said increase to maximize absorption, you would be correct. If we go up here and we look, there's 2 sort of key details to this. So we're looking at a villi, and I'm not going to be subtle here. almost always on the test, there's a question about the villi, its structure, and what the parts do. And for some reason, people like to skip over this and think, oh, it's just a little picture, it's not important. It's fairly important. Okay? So that's me being not subtle. Okay? So the important part of the villus is we have this structure here. I'm going to make the pen thicker. I don't know why it keeps disappearing on me. And it comes up here. It makes a network. Continues on down. What I'm drawing is blood coming in an artery and out of a vein. And as it progresses along, it becomes less and less oxygenated, hence why it changes color. We'll talk about that in the circulatory system. In the middle, it'll be kind of purple, a mixture of blue and red. And it makes a net around, network back and forth. And what ends up happening here is the nutrients get transported across the cells and into the blood. Okay? And in particular, you have amino acids, nucleotides, and sugars. Are absorbed into blood vessels of the villus. But that leaves one group of biological molecules out. What one has been left out? You said fat. You'd be correct. If you look down the middle of this villus, there's another structure. Okay. And down here it has a little L on it. Okay. And this is responsible, L, for the lipids or the fats. Not really what it stands for, but it's called the lacteal. The lacteal absorbs the fat. And again, we're going to talk, it's the breakdown products of fat, but in the end, that's what we're getting absorbed. And remember, fat's part of lipids, so the lacteal for the lipids. And the lacteal is really, and we'll write it over here, lacteal is part of our lymphatic system, which is actually part of our immune system. And we'll talk about our lymphatic system a little bit more when we talk about our circulatory system, but it mirrors your circulatory system, and it picks up excess fluids from your tissue and it delivers it back up behind your shoulder blade back in with your circulatory system. So your fat will eventually meet up with your blood system, but not right away. Okay? So that's the details of your small intestine. And just by way of thinking, if this is your mucosa layer here of your villus, what is this layer with the blood vessels? If you said submucosa, you'd be correct. And I'm sorry that those notes got rather messy crossing back and forth. I hope yours turned out neater for your sake. Finally, we're going to take a look at the large intestine. So just by perspective, looking at the drawing, this is the left side, and this is the right side of the human body. Okay? And this is important because when we talk about our small intestine or large intestine, it's a really key feature here, and sometimes you guys will have the misfortune of getting infection in one of these, and sometimes you'll have a stitch in your side and you'll come ask me about it and you'll say, oh, this hurts, should I be worried? If it's on your right side, you might have cause for being worried. If it's on your left side, you probably don't. Right at the bottom of your large intestine, where I've colored red, is a very nasty little organ that can cause us a lot of trouble. Does anyone know what it's called? You said appendix. You are correct. The problem is, if we watch the small intestine, it winds its way around and it dumps into the large intestine. But it actually dumps down in, and the appendix is right at the bottom of that, and sometimes food gets caught in there and it actually begins to get infected. Bacteria grow in it, and we have all sorts of problems. Okay. So this little sort of blind end below where the food comes in, it's not a very good space. If we're designed, or by evolution, it's not the best part of our design, kind of like our swallowing and the fact that food has to cross in our pharynx with air. So at the bottom of this, it's called the cecum. It's kind of a blind end where food can get caught. Above it, we have three parts to what's called our colon. Okay. I'm going to label these three parts. One goes up, it goes across, and then goes down. And if you go up a mountain, what's the fancy word for going up? Or up at building an elevator? If you said ascend, you'd be correct. And on our right side of our body, we have our ascending colon. This next word means to go across, and sometimes we use this very similar word, not identical, but similar word to mean like I blanked the desert, I went across the desert, usually when we go far distances. If you said traverse, you're very close to the real word for across, the transverse colon. And then for going down, well, if you go down the mountain, you said descending colon, you are correct. And then at the bottom of the descending colon, we have this little section here. I'm not sure why it gets its name. It's called the sigmoid colon. All these parts are important because, in particular for doctors, certain parts, you get colon cancer and they have to operate and remove various parts, and it is a way of just landmarking what parts are important. And then the bottom of the sigmoid colon, you have the rectum. At the very, very end, you have the anus. So that's the overall part. And the structure of the large intestine isn't terribly difficult. It's large because of its diameter, not because of its length. So it's approximately 6.5 centimeters in diameter, not quite 3 times the size of the small intestine. And it's only approximately 1.5 meters long. Its functions, well, the appendix function is unknown. But for a long time it was said to be useless, but recent studies within the last 2 years suggest it's a hideout for commensal bacteria. Commensal bacteria are your good bacteria, the ones you want in your body. So when the bad bacteria comes along and infects your system, it's thought that the good ones hide out in the appendix, and after the bad ones are gotten rid of, they come back out and repopulate your intestine. Okay, and we're going to learn why that's important in a second. So, but its known functions, one is absorption, but not so much of nutrients, this time of water, very important function to reabsorb your water so you don't become dehydrated, salts, and vitamins that are produced not so much straight from our food, but by our commensal bacteria. So when we digest the food, we can't gain access to these vitamins, but when the bacteria digest the food, they release the vitamins and we absorb them. The second thing it does is it stores undigested waste. What's our polite scientific word for undigested waste that's about to leave the bodies? You said feces, you'd be correct. Until defecation, removal of feces, which is elimination. Remember, not excretion, but elimination. And now, because I have sort of the maturity of a 4-year-old when it comes to this, we get into the fun part of the lecture where we actually get to talk about defecation. Okay. So defecation for adults, unless we're extremely ill, is a controllable process. But in young kids, not so controllable. And if you're really sick, we can override our control of it. So, the defecation reflex is part reflex, so part conscious, part reflex. And as we get older and older, we get better. Well, not older and older, but as we get older, from like a toddler to a young child, we actually learn how to take over conscious control of the reflex reaction. So here's what happens. 1. So feces over time will enter the rectum due to peristalsis. As it enters the rectum, it actually causes the rectal wall to stretch. And inner rectal wall are stretch receptors. So the stretch receptors initiate a nerve impulse, the details of which we talked about last unit, to the spinal cord. Which is the reflex arc part of this. And the brain, which is our conscious control of it. This reflex arc then causes motor neurons then cause internal anal sphincters. Yes, I said anal sphincters. I take almost as much delight in saying it as you probably do. Anal sphincters to relax while causing rectal muscles to contract. So opens the anus and contracts, causing defecation. So these are your internal anal sphincters. And these are the reflex portion. But we also have external anal sphincters. And these are under conscious control. And as a toddler moves into childhood, they actually learn to associate the sensation of when the internal anal sphincters relax. If it's inappropriate time for defecation, then they can override and keep the external anal sphincters contracted. Okay. So this one goes off to the brain. That's the defecation reflex. And when we're really sick, this external control will be overridden. Now, not only do we get to talk about defecation, we get to talk about the content of feces itself. And why would we waste time talking about feces? Well, it's a really important indicator of health. Okay? So, typically, healthy feces has a ratio 3/4 water to 1/4 indigestible material. Things that have never really entered the cells of our body. Such as fiber. Do you guys remember? What is the polymer of glucose that plants make that we can't digest? It starts with a C. E. If you got cellulose, excellent. If you spelt it better than I did, bonus points. And also bacteria. Now, if it's healthy, your feces should be brown in color due to oxidized iron. From recycled red blood cells. And a pigment called bilirubin. Also from red blood cells. And this is important because it's an indicator that your liver is actually recycling your red blood cells properly. And it indicates both that your blood is healthy and your liver is healthy. And feces also has an associated odor and sometimes even gas, which isn't a bad thing. It's actually due, well, socially it can be a bad thing, but in terms of your health, it's due to bacteria action necessary to produce some vitamins. The odor and gas are simply byproducts of the process. An exception, though, equals the lactose intolerant. In this case, you get excess gas as bacteria essentially feast on the lactose that your body is unable to digest. So you're feeding them an excess amount of sugar. They're having a good old party making gas. Meanwhile, you're suffering. Now let's talk about some of the negative extremes of feces. Terribly pleasant topic, but one that we're all afflicted with from one time or another. Diarrhea. Very often this is a result of an infection in lower intestine. Often due to food poisoning. Sometimes due to contaminated water. And your body's trying to get rid of that infection, whatever that bug might be. So what it does is it increases peristalsis and decreases water absorption from the large intestine. to allow body to flush out offending organisms. Not flush out, flush out. Sometimes somewhat violently. It's actually a highly effective process. If not comfortable, it protects your body. The problem is, if prolonged, you can get severe dehydration, which is going to cause your blood pressure to drop. Which in turn is going to cause organ failure, and potentially death. And this happens very often in impoverished areas, especially when there's a natural disaster where the water becomes contaminated with fecal matter. So in places such as Haiti after the earthquake, lots of people died from an infection caused by a bacteria called cholera, and basically they weren't treated for the cholera infection and they suffered severe dehydration to the point that they actually die. It's really sad because they can be given tablet form medication for a cost of $1 or $2 per person, very low cost, and it will save them from dying. Other people have this unfortunate condition of nervous diarrhea. So when they are under situations of stress, the nervous system stimulates intestinal wall. In response to stress. Now, we're not really sure why this happens. From an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't seem like a very good idea to have to stop and have diarrhea in a situation of stress. But some people have suggested it actually helps the body lose weight so that it can flee faster. Okay. Whether or not that's really the case is yet to be proven. Now, at the opposite end or extreme of diarrhea is constipation. This is the condition of the drying out of feces, not enough water. It can lead to what's called hemorrhoids, which are enlarged blood vessels around the anus. Which, according to the commercials for hemorrhoid cream, are not very comfortable. And if you talk to many pregnant women, suffer hemorrhoids. So it's not a pleasant condition, but more importantly, routine constipation may contribute to colon cancer. And we're going to talk about what colon cancer is below. But here it may contribute to colon cancer by increasing lining of colon increasing exposure of the colon lining to bacterial toxins. So the idea is it's a good idea to have bacteria in your colon, especially commensal bacteria, but there's also negative bacteria in your colon that should be flushed out regularly so that the toxins they produce when they're digesting things don't build up, because these toxins can actually contribute to the formation of cancer. So, to avoid both the discomfort and the long-term effects of constipation, there are some very simple solutions. Simply increase your water intake. And increase fiber intake to stay the so-called regular, going to the washroom on a regular basis. Now, we were talking about feces because it is a learning outcome, and not just to amuse myself, but really to lead into this really important topic of colon cancer. Colon cancer, in 2012 alone, is predicted to affect or to be diagnosed in 23,300 Canadians in 2012, and will kill over 9,000, approximately 25 Canadians a day. Which is really devastating, because in many ways, many of those deaths can be prevented. One, just as simply by increasing your H2O intake and increasing your fiber intake, and also by getting tested. Can be treated if caught by testing. But a lot of people don't go get the testing that they should because they're embarrassed by it. When you think about it, what is, let's say, maybe an hour of embarrassment tops in a doctor's office compared to death? You know, it's one of those things you have to put up with to enjoy all the great things in life. Okay? So it's very simple to treat. But here's what happens. Typically, if we look at the lining of the cell, or the colon, you have lots of cells. They're very active, they're constantly dividing, which gives them opportunities for things to genetically go wrong and become cancerous. Very often, they overdivide and form these little things called polyps. And lots of polyps are benign, they're not dangerous, but when a doctor does a test for colon cancer, if they see many polyps, it's an indication that you may be heading down the road towards cancer. So a very small percentage of those polyps will keep growing. They won't stop growing. And they'll get larger. And eventually they will form tumors. And if not treated, the tumors could actually do what's called metastasize, or spread to other organs in your body. So if you're tested for it on a regular basis, typically around your 50s, tested for it on a regular basis, they'll figure out if you have polyps, and if any one of them continue to grow or form into tumors, they can go in and quite simply just take a little bit of your colon out, and you will recover quite fine typically. If they don't catch it early enough, they have to take more and more significant portions of the colon out, has a harder impact on your digestive system. And also it gives the opportunity for it to spread to your other organs. Okay. Once caught though, very treatable if caught in the early stages. So, moral of the story, eat your broccoli. Broccoli is a good source of fiber. Okay. That's the end of the lesson. If you have any questions, please come see me. Otherwise, I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you in class.